Welcome to a brief introduction to the JetPROP DLX. This aircraft has tremendous performance and significant drawbacks. And in our introduction, we'll just talk about some of those briefly. First of all, we're up here where the big news is on this aircraft. This is a PT6-35 engine. Now, this aircraft started out its life as a Malibu Mirage, and the founder of rocket engineering, Darwin Conrad, saw this airframe as an optimum airframe to hang a PT6 on. What the JetPROP has that the Meridian does not is an inertial separator that can be turned off. So you only have the inertial separator turned off when you're not on the ground and when you're not taking ice or a heavy precip into the engine. Now, here's the advantage to this, where you can turn the inertial separator off. It gives you somewhere between 150 and 200 pound-feet of torque with no additional fuel burn. Or you can pull the throttle back, maintain the same amount of torque as it would have with the inertial separator on, and save about 4 gallons an hour in fuel burn. Very significant difference between the JetPROP and the Meridian. Now, this brings me to a general overall, philosophical difference between the Meridian and the JetPROP. The Meridian is designed to be easy to operate. So it's a lot easier, less complicated, to not have an inertial separator that you can turn off. It just stays on all the time. And it's so you don't have to worry about it. Is it on when I'm on the ground? Did I turn it off? But what you do is you lose the performance associated with this ability to turn off the inertial separator. Now, another advantage of having the separator off when you're up in the air and not taking in heavy precipitation is your internal turbine temperature, which is a limiter of how hard you can push this engine, goes down when the inertial separator is off. So it's a big advantage. Now, inside this compartment here is the header tank, which is another significant difference between the Meridian and the JetPROP. Both of these aircraft are fuel limited because they really were designed for piston engines, which burn a lot less fuel. In order to get some more fuel and also to aid in the balance, JetPROP designers put a fuel tank right here. This gives you an additional 11.1 gallons of usable fuel. Another advantage of having this fuel up here is that it comes from the tanks, where the fuel can get very, very cold at high altitudes after you've been up for several hours, and it brings it into here, into this header tank, which is right behind the engine. And this acts as a preheater for the fuel so that there is no limitation on how long you can fly at a high altitude, which there was on the earlier Meridians. Now, this also, as with the inertial separator, adds an element of complexity because now we have to have pumps which pump the fuel from the tanks, wing tanks, into the header tank. Then we have pumps that pump from the header tank into the engine. And so there's more pumps to mess with on the JetPROP than there are on the Meridian. Now let's take a view inside the cockpit where the action happens.
As I mentioned, this started life as a Malibu Mirage, which is a piston engine airplane. When it was converted to a turbine, you begin to enter into some significant problems. The turbine burns over 50% more fuel per hour. The fuel weighs more. And what begins to happen is the fuel begins to take up all of the usable, useful load of the aircraft. If you top this completely off with jet fuel, you have 158 gallons, and you now have a 1 to 2 passenger airplane. If you want to carry some people, then you have to have a lot less fuel on board and you don't have the range. So it's a major compromise on the JetPROP. The Meridian has quite a bit higher gross weight than the JetPROP, but it also weighs about 550 pounds more. But it still holds about 1 extra person in useful load with a comparable range. Another disadvantage that you have when an airplane has been converted is some of the layout of the thing has been altered and it becomes quite convoluted. For example, I have switches over here for environmental, prop governor override, inertial separator switch, oil door switch, all of them in an awkward location, and it no longer gives you a nice flow where you have all of the individual things such as anti-ice there, environmental there, lighting there, and so forth as it started out. With all the power hanging out the front, it requires a lot of rudder and a lot of rudder trim. Anytime you make a power change, it's a rudder trim change. Make a pitch change, it's a rudder trim change. Also, when you're at cruise, you have the radar pod underneath the right wing that has an asymmetrical drag and pulls the right wing back, which you need to counteract with left rudder. This particular airplane does not have enough left rudder to center the ball. Another oddity with the JetPROP is its 2 batteries. It's capable of starting the engine on either of the 2 batteries, but it really likes them both. Having the 2 batteries gives you, again, more complexity, but it also gives you more redundancy. In the event that you had one battery fail, you can turn to the other battery and still start it or be able to operate some of your equipment in the event of a generator failure. Another significant difference between the JetPROP and the Meridian is efficiency. At idle, this thing burns about 13 gallons an hour, where the Meridian burns about 21 gallons. At cruise, the Meridian is going to burn about 20% more than the JetPROP burns. This translates into additional range. So with these tanks topped, even though we have less fuel than the Meridian, we have greater range. We can go, if we back off to about 28 gallons an hour, we have about 5 hours and 15 minutes of range. So you have a good 4.5 hour with IFR reserves. And that gives you range of significantly in excess of 1,000 nautical miles. Now, the most exciting thing about the JetPROP is its phenomenal climb rate. If you have this plane lightly loaded, taken off from sea level, it will climb at over 3,000 feet per minute. At gross weight, it will climb at around 2,500 feet per minute initially, and will still be climbing at over 1,000 feet a minute when you reach 27,000 feet. We climb from about 5,000 feet to 27,000 feet in about 12 minutes, and we burn about 12 gallons of fuel, including our taxi burn. The JetPROP has the same designator as the Meridian. They're both P46 Tango. The JetPROP, however, far out climbs the Meridian, and the controllers aren't used to it. So unless they know what a JetPROP is, they are going to plan on you climbing at a lot slower rate. So when you file, it's best to request unrestricted climb. As I mentioned, the PT6A-35 is thermodynamically a 750 horsepower engine. It's derated in this application, but there's nothing mechanical changed. So if a ham-handed pilot pushes a throttle too far forward, he can over-torque exceed the maximum allowable torque of 1,344 pound-feet. If he does that, the plane is grounded until it has a visual inspection of the motor mount. Didn't hurt the motor, but it can certainly hurt the motor mount. Now, another oddity about this having been converted from a piston to a turbine is that in its original form, it had a VNE of 198 knots. That's the red line in a piston aircraft. But when it was converted to a turbine, it goes to a VMO. You might say velocity maximum operating. That was reduced to 170 knots because in a turbine they do not allow you the yellow range or the caution range. So interesting that you have about almost twice the horsepower and your airspeed is limited to 28 knots less than it was in a piston. Now this airspeed limitation of 170 knots is not a huge practical limitation because at 27,000 feet and 170 knots indicated, you're doing about 260 knots depending upon your outside air temperature. And that's about where you want to run the engine anyway. That brings it up to its maximum allowable interturbine temperature. And so it is not functionally a big limitation, but it's certainly an oddity in this converted airplane. The 170 knot limitation is, however, a restriction in your descent, where you could have previously descended in the piston version at up to 198 knots if you're in smooth air. In this airplane, you are limited to 170 knots in the descent. So what you lose in the climb, you can now not make up in the descent. The JetPROP has a tremendous glide ratio of around 20-1. So if you're at 27,000 feet, you lose the engine, you can glide for 75 miles, and you have about 45 minutes before you're going to be landing the airplane. So in short, here's how I fly this airplane. It is cruising altitude of usually 27,000 feet, pull it back to 32 gallons an hour. I'm getting about 262 knots. I've got a range of just around 1,000 miles. In summary, the JetPROP is a great performing airplane and a very efficient airplane. So if you're an efficiency junkie or you're a performance junkie and you're willing to put up with the idiosyncrasies of a converted airplane, the JetPROP is for you.